if conscience is built into our nature, if it's the voice of God, then what do we mean when we say that conscience must be formed? Great question. Both are true, right? Conscience built into human nature, and it must be formed. And this is really important. And all of first principles are common. Everybody's got them. But that doesn't mean that everyone sees them with the same clarity, with the same penetration, with the same consequences. Everybody sees them at least a little. But if you live a life contrary to them, what's going to happen? You're going to see them very dimly. And we call that, for example, spiritual blindness. Every person who's under the influence of a vice, living contrary to conscience, they're going to see those principles less and less because they're going to be restricting them. I'm going to apply the golden rule only in my little circle, only with regard to me, only with regard to certain limits that I'm going to set. And so, yes, everybody's got them, but one person, say the saint, sees them with so much more extension. And this is true in general. St. Thomas Aquinas, what makes him more wise than somebody else, ultimately? Is it because he knows so many facts? No way. He probably did know a lot of facts, but that's not what made him wise. Because you can have people with photographic memories who are not at all wise. Right? Because wisdom isn't knowing all kinds of facts, knowing all the names in a phone book. Right? What's wisdom? Wisdom is seeing these first principles that we talked about in all their extension. So the person who's truly wise, for example, is the person who sees in all its extension, God is to be loved above all things, and my neighbor as myself. That's the wise person. And so the saint is the wise person. And that's why when the church makes someone a doctor of the church, well, what's the first criterion? They have to be a canonized saint. Because that's what gives you wisdom, is to see the double commandment of charity in all its extension. And the same thing is true in terms of philosophy. So St. Thomas Aquinas is so great, not because he knows all kinds of things, but because he sees the full extension of first principles, more than, say, I do, more than the rest of us do. And it's God sees everything through how many things? One. God knows everything that can be known, everything through one thing, His one word. That's the infinite wisdom, is to know everything through one. And here, even among us, the wise person isn't the one who knows all kinds of the multiplicity. The wise person is who sees the full extension of these simple principles. And that's why wise people don't have to be learned people. Right? Though very often we find people who are really wise and are, in terms of education, etc., are very simple. Right? And there are many canonized saints who, think of the Curé of Ars, who flunked out of his seminary and only through sheer mercy was finally ordained. He's the wisest person in France. And we could get so many other examples. St. Catherine of Siena. Right? So wisdom is seeing these first principles in all their extension. And so the more we live in accordance with them, the more we see them. And the more we live contrary to them, the less we see them. So yes, they're universal and they need to be formed. And we form them in two ways. So we form conscience by living well. That's the first and by far the most important. By living in accordance with what we already know. See, the growth of conscience is like a circle. And a vital circle, right? There's vital circles and there are vicious circles. A vital circle is if conscience shows me something and I live in accordance with it, what happens? It starts to grow. And if I live in accordance with that growth, well, then it grows still more. And if I live in accordance with that further thing, then it grows more. And you get a vital circle. You get the growth of sanctity. But the opposite can happen, right? If I live not in accordance with what I see, well, I'm going to see less. And if I don't live in accordance even with that less that I see, I'm going to see still less. And a person can live their whole life like that. Or the other way. Right? So we need to form. So that's the first way. And then the second way that we form it is by reading good things, by hearing good things. In other words, by seeking out, for example, reading the catechism. So it would be a great thing if Catholics in general would make it a point to do spiritual reading. In other words, to read good things a certain amount of time a week. Right? That would be a fantastic thing. And we don't do enough of that in the church. And part of it is because we're such an active people. We tend to, good people who want to serve the church and do good things for the church, we tend to allot more of our free time to the active part than to the formative part. Yeah. And so it's very important that it's much better to invest, a good amount of time, whatever it may be, a certain number of information, so that when I do act, even though it's for less time, it'll give much more fruit. Right? It's so important. And that's why I think we need to do so much more in terms of formation. And, even though we spend less time in activity, our activity will bear more fruit. And I'm just going to throw in here an ad for, in addition to this, Ave Maria has its master's program in pastoral theology. That would be a great way of getting, sorry. And we've got it here in St. Louis, so we're looking for a class for next fall. Okay, sorry. I'm not sorry. I fear that large parts of Catholic colleges and even many parochial schools are now populated with teachers who consciously or unconsciously are skeptics, nominalists, nihilists, socialists, Marxists, and what do we do if I'm right? I'm afraid this is true. Right? You are right. And again, this is why, as a church, I think it's so important that we invest the time in formation before we start to act. So if I'm going to teach catechism, that's a great thing. But I should have a certain holy fear of teaching it if I don't know it. Right? It's great. It's wonderful that people involved in the RCA and do all kinds of... But if they don't know the faith, then what are they passing on? If I'm teaching religion in a Catholic school, or even if I'm just teaching in a Catholic school and I don't know my faith very well, that's not a good thing. And so it's so important that we invest as a church in formation. Yeah.
And textbooks.
In textbooks, right, getting good textbooks. And this is why those people, think of Mother Angelica, how much good she did with EWTN, and we all need to be doing that, each in our own place and way, and that's one of the key apostles, for example, the Association of Hebrew Catholics, is to help give Catholics the formation that we need. But every movement in the church should be investing in formation. And it pays, it's so important. Because otherwise, we're going to end up transmitting to people what the world thinks. Well, the world and the church are in reality in combat. Right? There's a battle going on, and it's a battle of ideas. And so it's so easy to get confused between what the world thinks and what the church thinks. St. Paul has this great line, "Be not conformed to this world, but to Christ." And they're going to be opposites. And Jesus, when he speaks about the world doesn't come off very well. Right? The world will always be contrary to the church, even in a Christian society. A Christian society is still going to be worldly. And so you're always going to have to be doing combat with the dominant ideas in a society. And that's especially true for all those who are involved in the apostolate of education, and especially Catholic colleges. What a beautiful responsibility it is. But it's a tremendous responsibility that requires that we get rightly formed. I have a beautiful story about this. One of my couple, I love to give this example, but I had a couple of my Ave Maria master's program in pastoral theology from Indonesia, and they couldn't have children. They wanted to do some kind of ministry in the church. They didn't know what, but they knew something that they had to be rightly formed before they set out on it. And they looked, and they couldn't find anything in Indonesia. It's not surprising. They couldn't find anything in the Philippines or Australia in that part of Asia that met what they were looking for. And so they had a cousin who did my program who lived in Wisconsin, and so they traveled halfway across the world and lived with this cousin for 3 years to get a master's. They didn't know what they were going to do with it, and then God showed them. They started Catholic Answers in Indonesian language, and they get 100,000, 90,000 hits on their website. every month, and all these questions come, I don't know, something like 90, 100 questions come in a day, and many of them from Buddhists and atheists and, above all, Muslims. It's the largest Muslim country in the world. Anyway, but the key was the beginning, right? They recognized they needed to be formed first. And so, you have to go halfway across the world and learn this English. You do it.
You must have a good website, too. It's like you.
I don't think so. It was word of mouth. Their cousin. But anyway. How do first principles relate to the natural law? First principle is the foundation of the natural law. Natural law is simply pulling out more conclusions from the first principles. There's nothing in natural law that's not in the first principles, but it's pulling them out more. So, for example, the first principles are good is to be done, evil to be avoided, the golden rule. All right, and we saw from that, we naturally recognize, say, marital fidelity is a good. And so therefore, adultery is evil, because it's contrary to that good. Good is to be done also for my neighbor. But implicit, hidden in that, are other things that we don't immediately grasp, but not first principles. For example, polygamy is wrong, because polygamy goes against marital fidelity. I can't have marital fidelity to 2 or 3 or 4 at the same time. And so it's hidden, as it were, in the first principles. But it goes beyond it. And so it's part of natural law that polygamy is wrong. But it's not immediately evident. And so therefore, this is a clear example of how conscience is universal, but it requires formation. So if you grow up in a society that practices polygamy, you're not going to see it so clearly. And a great example of this is Abraham. Right? So his conscience wasn't so clarified because he lived in a society in which polygamy was rampant. It was normal. And so he didn't see it as clearly wrong. And yet we see, reading the account of Abraham, this wasn't good. This led to some very evident marital problems between Hagar and Sarah. And so we see in the very consequence of the story why polygamy is against natural law. And so it's rooted in first principles, but you need to flesh them out. And this is where society comes in. Everybody knows the very first principles, say the golden rule, but the consequences of them, that's not immediately evident to everyone. And that's where this is, I would say, the most important part of the common good of any society is educating society in terms of these consequences of the first principles that are part of the natural law, but yet somebody left to themselves or in a bad context won't see, or at least not with the same clarity. And so we're so blessed to be in a society in which much of the natural law is socially intact. But unfortunately, things like abortion, things like contraception, and it's becoming more... Because of that, our need for the social reinforcement, when society fails, it makes it so much easier for the individuals or members of that society to fail. Right? So again, yes, it's common, but the conclusions of it need social reinforcement. And therefore, this is the key. This is why the social doctrine of the church is so important. Because the magisterium of the church has a God-given clarity about natural law and about what's harder to see in natural law. And that's why it may not be evident to me at first sight why contraception is wrong. But thanks be to God, there's Holy Mother Church who has the clarity. And so we don't do anyone any service if we say, just follow your conscience. Because conscience needs to be formed. And this is precisely the mission of the church, to form it. But it's also the mission of each one of us, each in our own context. And it's not so easy. And so we have to recognize that, we need to be formed first. And so that requires humility, right? Intellectual humility. That I shouldn't think if it seems to me that I see things differently than the church's magisterium on these issues of morality, I ought to think that the problem is me. But that requires humility. David?
Would you say that first principles are the divine law written in the nature of man?
Right.
Is that a fit? Because I always
Sure.
thought natural law as being divine law.
Right.
But natural law isn't primitive enough. These first principles are more primitive.
Right. Natural law is made up of the first principles plus the conclusions that come out of them.
So that's not divine law.
Sure, all of that's divine because it's all written into us. But everybody, what's common are the first principles. That's what everybody sees. And then things like polygamy is wrong, or homosexual acts are wrong, or contraception is wrong. Not everybody sees it. And that's where, especially where we need the formation. But it's still divine law. Right? It's divine law, all of those things. It's just that it's not something that we see immediately. What we see immediately is good is to be done, evil is to be avoided, the golden rule, common good over the private good, things like that. And from those, we need to pull out other things, like the Ten Commandments, and from the Ten Commandments, pull out their consequences. And that's where society needs to help. All of it is from God. All of it is natural law. Natural law is a participation in us of God's eternal law. Right? That's St. Thomas Aquinas' definition of natural law. It's our by participation, our sharing in God's eternal law. And we share it through conscience. But it needs to be formed. Right? And so when God revealed the Ten Commandments, the moral law given to Israel, is simply it was the gift of revealing what God had already written. It was already written, but because it's hard for us, because the inclination to sin, because of the social scandal of sinful society, etc., what a great grace it was for God to reveal what He'd already written in the heart. Right? And that's the glory of Israel, to receive the commandments, the Torah.
For everybody.
Right, for everyone. Right? So the Ten Commandments for everyone. Sorry. it's for mankind because it's already written on the heart. The only one that's in the third commandment, thou shalt keep the Sabbath. What's natural law is that we have to keep a day for God. We have to keep a time for God. That it be the Sabbath or it be Sunday. That is something that's positive law. That's got to be determined by the legislator.
What you say is what was the thing you said just now was in positive law.
Positive law would be that it be this day or that day. Right? Natural law is that time has to be consecrated to God. And it's fitting that it be a reasonable time. But its positive law is something that we couldn't know by nature. And that was that God asked of Israel the Sabbath. And He's asking of the church Sunday, the day of the resurrection. Right? So that's positive law. But that time being given to God is natural law. Right? So the Ten Commandments are fundamentally natural law, but written perfectly in perfect order by God. Marcia?
Even though certain aspects are less clear, like contraception or still have some
Right.
sense.
Right, people have some sense of it, and that's why people generally are ashamed to buy condoms. I mean, we're ashamed of that. We don't just trumpet about that I'm going into because we have a sense that that's something shameful about it.
When you did your studies in Rome, we have a real problem with blatant homosexuality today. I presume in my readings it goes all the way back into history. There are no gay animals. I mean, I don't see animals in the animal kingdom.
Right.
I think there are.
So is it a learned sort of thing?
Right.
A learned sort of thing that has come about?
Right. It's obviously, in other words, in the animal world, animals act by instinct.
Right.
And so nature doesn't fail in the majority. There might be cases in which nature fails in a small number of cases in nature. But the key is this, that sexuality of a human being, we'll talk about this later when we do theology of the body, but the sexuality of a human being is the sexuality of someone made in God's image. And thus, it's by that very fact on an immeasurably different plane than that of simply biological reproduction. And therefore, That works in two ways. It means that two things. It means that we can transgress more than any animal will ever transgress. But it also means that we can live it immeasurably higher, as within holy matrimony. And so we can, because of our freedom, we'll talk about it later though, because of our freedom, we can obviously fall below the beasts, but through the grace of God, ascend up into heaven. A related question. We'll come back to that whole question, though, of homosexuality when we look at human sexuality. Are the first principles the same as in Jeremiah 31 to 33, which is the prophecy about the new covenant, in which the law is written not on tablets of stone, but in the heart? And what Jeremiah is speaking about there is the new law of Christ, which is essentially the gift of the Spirit. The gift of charity, we could say. It's the gift of God's grace by which we can do the law. And it actually goes beyond natural law. Natural law has to do with following the first moral principles and their conclusions. But nature can't give charity, because charity is divine. Charity is to love God as Father, and to love my neighbor not simply as myself, but to love my neighbor as God loves them, as Christ has loved them. That's a new commandment, right? To love my neighbor as Christ has loved him. That's beyond nature. Nature can't do that. That can only be done by grace. But if I'm doing that by grace, well, then I'm fulfilling all the commandments better. So Aristotle says it like this. He says, it's possible to do good without virtue, without charity, but you can't do well without charity. In other words, you can do, somebody who doesn't have charity can do materially the commandments. They cannot kill, they cannot commit adultery, they cannot steal. But in order to do the commandments well, we have to not kill, not steal with charity. In other words, we have to not simply not do the evil, but do good the way God wants it to be done, which is out of charity, out of supernatural. In other words, out of a sharing in God's own love. That's what's promised in Jeremiah 31. That sharing in God's own love that enables us to do the natural law and to do it as God intends, out of love. And that we can't do by nature.
On whose hearts, when you get to
Right.
that quote, yeah.
Right. Because
Where's that quote?
Jeremiah 31.
Okay. Who?
I will write it on the law on the heart, the Torah on the heart, not simply on the tablet.
What's the quote? Where's it from?
Jeremiah
Jeremiah. Okay.
31.
And that-
Also Ezekiel.
Yeah.
Ezekiel 36, I think.
Isn't it brought up someplace in the New Testament?
Right. Paul.
Where Paul?
Letter to the Romans. Paul speaks about the law being written on the heart. He's speaking there about pagans. When pagans do what is written in the Torah, but they don't know the Torah, it's because the law is written on the heart. But that's different than what Jeremiah is talking about.
Okay.
Because what Jeremiah is talking about is not only doing what the law says, because it's written in the heart, but it being written in a higher way on the heart.
Yeah. But
It's written on everybody's heart by nature. But grace, when we're baptized, when we live in a state of grace, it gets written on our heart in grace. And that's what enables us to do it, not simply do good, but to do that good well.
because one's Old Testament, one's New Testament.
Well, they're both right, but even in the, that's right. So the law commanded, ultimately the law commanded what it couldn't give. It couldn't give it because to do the law well requires grace. And the law doesn't give the grace. Right? This is what St. Paul develops. And that's why the new law, which is the grace of Christ, enables us to do the old law the way God wants it done.
And us being being who us, what us is in the New Testament writing. What?
Right. Well, it's all, for all, because all are called into the new covenant.
After Christ,
Right.
for all.
Oh, sure, it's for all. Right, it's for all.
All right. And the other, something was there, but nobody could get there.
Right, because see, simply by nature, so we could distinguish three eras of mankind. The era of mankind before Abraham, or before Moses, in which all mankind was simply under natural law. Well, there were still just men under natural law. The patriarchs, Noah was a just man, and Job was not an Israelite. He was a just man. So it's possible, under natural law, to live the commandments. So all the just men, under natural law, were already living the 10 Commandments. And presumably, they could only do this through the aid of grace. But nevertheless, it was a great gift to mankind to call Abraham out of Mesopotamia and to give the law through Moses to the people, so that not only do we have it written on the heart, but we've got it written on paper, on tablets, so that we can know with a certainty that God has commanded this. But it's a still greater grace to live in the new covenant, in which God has ordinary channels of grace, which are the sacraments of the church, by which we can get that grace efficaciously, so that I can live the 10 Commandments, which are also written on the heart. Right? So these 3 ages of mankind, they're like 3 ages of an individual: childhood, adolescence, and maturity. But of course, it's possible to be in the new covenant and to live outside of the natural law. This is the great tragedy of nominal Catholics who don't recognize what we receive. Okay. Relationship between conscience and soul. Well, by having a human soul, we potentially have conscience. But we need to, if someone's handicapped, they have a human soul, but they can't use conscience. Because in order to use conscience, you have to have the age of reason, have a certain reasoning ability. Because we're talking about reasoning, first principles and grasping conclusions. So in the soul, there's the capacity, but the exercise requires that there be no obstacle, like brain damage or some other kind of mental problem. Okay, is conscience fixed at death? Yes. Our conscience should be growing all through our life, and at death, we're fixed, for better or worse. The amount of charity we have at death will be that which we have for eternity. And if we don't have it at death, charity, we won't have it for all eternity. And so that level of conscience, deformed or formed, is what we'll stay with for eternity. Right? We're given this life to forge our identity, to forge our mortal identity. And at death, the saying is, where the tree falls, there it lies. Okay? Here's a beautiful comment about nominalism fails. Nominalism is the idea that there is no universal. We can't know universal. Nominalism fails because when we look at dogs and we see they all have a certain kind of ear, legs, tail, paws, color, teeth, all these are also universals. Sure, that's right. Because we're always grasping universals. And even in science, they're constantly grasping universals. We're talking about light and energy and work, and all of these are universals. And so a scientist who's a nominalist is in contradiction with himself. He's using universals, and yet he's denying them. Is common sense a gift from God? Or is it like conscience? Great question. Both of them are gifts from God. Right? Both. It's just that common sense, the way I'm using it here, is wider than conscience. Conscience is the fruit of having first moral principles. So conscience presupposes common moral sense. Because we have a common moral sense, these first principles, we have conscience. We can judge particular actions. And so conscience is applying first principles to this act here and now. Should I steal this or not? And so common sense is wider. And common sense also is not just the practical moral principles, but it's also the theoretical ones. For example, nothing can be and not be in the same way at the same time. That belongs to common sense, the way I'm using the term. And so common sense is wider, but they're both great gifts of God. They're both sharing in God's own knowledge. I think it's what gives human dignity. Can we drown out common sense like we can drown out conscience? Unfortunately, they tend to go together. Right? And so, sure, we can drown out common sense, and very often this happens tragically in philosophy class. And it's so tragic because people go there, they spend, out of goodwill, they want to find, and then it's even more tragic when it happens in a Catholic college. And that can happen too. But in any case, sure, we can drown out common sense, and we do it in the two ways. By living contrary to it, and by reading bad things. In other words, reading philosophers who deny it. But if we live well and we read those bad philosophers, our good living, in the end, will probably enable us to see those philosophers are crazy. Hopefully. Okay. Well, thanks so much. Great questions.